So I've been teaching at a university for about 20 years, but believe it or not, I was not a good student. In elementary school, all of my report cards said, "Kid is smart, but he just doesn't work hard enough." And in high school, I graduated at the very bottom of my class. And when I was in college, I got okay grades for a while, but I was really tired of especially failing tests or doing really poorly on tests when people around me did great on tests, and I couldn't figure out why they did well on tests and I didn't do well on tests. And after about way too many years in education, it took me 5 years to get my bachelor's and about 9 years to get my master's. And over that time, I sort of figured out a way to hack the testing system. And I eventually ended up with a 3-step process for acing every test. I want to share with you those 3 steps. And the third one's really sort of weird. This is the one that surprised me, that once I figured it out, all of a sudden, it made a big difference. So here are the 3 steps, but first I want to just say a word about tests themselves. So here's the thing. Tests in and of themselves are not easy or hard. It really has to do with how you approach the test. Here's something to think about. If you study easy, tests are hard. If you study hard, tests are easy. So at the end of the day, it's not really so much about the content in that test, it's about how much investment you put into the process of preparing for the test. So here are the 3 steps of acing every test. And test taking is an art. So ART is the way we're going to think about how you're going to ace every test. The A in acing every test is attention. Now, attention is a resource like money or time, and as a student, it's the greatest resource that you have. Kind of think of attention sort of like dollars, right? You only have a certain amount of money to spend, and once you spend it, it's gone. It's kind of like that when you get to class. You have a certain amount of attention, and you can spend that however you want. You could spend it looking at Instagram or in TikTok, or you could spend that paying attention to what's happening in class, but you can't do both. You can't pay an unlimited amount to everything. You can only pay attention to one thing at a time. I had this student once, and in every class, she aced every test I ever gave her, 100% almost on everything. I asked her once, like, how do you do it? How do you ace every one of these tests? And her answer to me was that I just pay attention to what's going on in class. If you start this process with paying attention, that is going to set the table for you acing every test you ever take. But that's the first step. You gotta pay attention. The R in acing every test, the art of acing every test, has to do with review. Now, a lot of times what happens is, you go to class, you write the notes down, you cram it into your backpack, or maybe you put it in a notebook, and then you go to the next class, you take the next notes and you put it back in there, but you never really look at the notes again. You just sort of pile them up and forget about them until the test is coming up, then you grab them, you pull them out, and then you start studying. And you realize that, like, those first notes you took, you haven't looked at those for, since the class started, 2 months ago or something, and you don't remember anything about it, right? And so reviewing means that at the end of the day, after you've taken your notes, you file them away and you look over them again. And you try to remember what happened, ask questions, make connections, and then the next day, you pull out your notebook and you look at the previous notes and you look through them again and you read through them and you try to remember what happened and you try to summarize what you looked at, and then you ask questions. How does this connect to what we're looking at now? How does all of this relate to what the class is about? And then the next time you take notes, you put those in and you look back at your first notes, you look back at the second notes, and you look at this note, and you just keep doing that as the class goes along. And you realize that once you have done this, you have been looking at these notes a ton. Now, here's the thing to remember. Repetition is the key to knowledge. Repetition is the key to knowledge. Repetition is the key to knowledge. What's the key to knowledge? Repetition. The more you look at something, the more it's going to stick in your brain. And so the R of the art of acing every test is to review, review, review. Look at the notes over and over and over again. And the more you do that, the more it's going to make an impact long term. When you sit down to take that test, you've looked at this material so many times, you almost know it by heart. The T in the art of acing every test is take the test early. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I don't mean to jump, to break into the professor's office and steal the test, but write your own test. As you are going through the material, think about the kind of questions that could be asked. When I started doing this, I was tired of not doing well in this certain professor's test, and as I was listening in class and I was studying, I would start to think, okay, what kind of question might he use for this? And this is a great way to pay attention in class, is as you are taking notes, just jot off to the side multiple choice, like whatever it is, Socrates was a philosopher. If they say that, it's like, that might be a true or false question. Socrates was a plumber. False. He was a philosopher, right? And as you are listening and as you are reviewing, just jot down test questions about this, right? And as I did this, I would take the test, I would make really hard questions, and I would go back 2 or 3 days later and I would take the test, and I either did well or I forgot something in the studying process. And by the time I took my professor's test, I had taken that test so many times, they'd taken a much harder test. I'd written a harder test than he did, that I did well on his. And after a while, he's like, why do you keep doing so well on my test? You used to not do very well on the test, and now you're like acing all of them. And I said, well, I just took the test early. Looks at me like, did you break in and steal it or something? No, I just wrote my own test questions. I made them really hard, so by the time I sat down to take your test, I'd already done it so many times, it was pretty easy. And this is something you can do with friends, like a way of studying, write tests for each other. That way, when you've taken the test, it's not the first time. You've already taken this test a bunch of times. It's been different, but you're ready for what happens. So here's the thing, paying attention in class, reviewing constantly, and taking the test early by writing it yourself all take a lot of time and a lot of effort. It's a lot of work, but it really comes down to the idea that this is all about you and your investment. It's up to you how well you do in the class, ultimately. It's how much you want to invest in your education. And if you invest, and if you are strategic about these 3 steps, paying attention in class, reviewing constantly, take the test early, I guarantee that you will ace every test. Or if you don't ace every test, you can get all of your money back that you spent watching this video. Go get them.